Hi everyone, thank you for joining us online today for Friday Focus. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, Friday Focus is an online talk series hosted by the Hunterian, and we are the museum and art gallery at the University of Glasgow. In each edition of these talks, we'll hear from a different speaker covering a different topic, and we tend to look at our exhibitions and displays that are happening across our venues, as well as research that goes on at the Hunterian and the University of Glasgow, and all the exciting work that happens behind the scenes with our collections. Um, in this year, 2025, Glasgow is celebrating its 850th anniversary, and we're marking the occasion at the Hunterian with a series of displays, events, talks, and blogs which look at the ways in which the city has transformed over those years, and makes connections with objects and artworks from the Hunterian collections. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by Professor Claire A.P. Wilston, who's going to talk to us today about the work of Glasgow boy Edward A. Walton and his involvement in the Glasgow City Chambers murals. Oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback there. Maybe, uh, sorry, Claire, I'm just going to mute you for a second and then we'll unmute you when we come to the talk. So Claire is going to give us a bit of a presentation, and then there'll be some time at the end for any questions that anybody has. And you can pop your questions in the chat by clicking on the speech bubble at the very bottom of your screen, and then I will read those out for you at the very end. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us online today, and I will just unmute Claire and hand over now to deliver this week's talk.
Here we are. Well, thank you very much, Elaine, for that introduction. And it's very exciting to have the chance to share with you a closer look at these two fascinating sketches that are in the Hunterian collections and are Walton's very first ideas for the four fascinating murals of Glasgow's legend and history that were painted in the 1890s. Just trying to move on. It's not letting me move on. Oh, strange. There we are. I can do it that way. This is a little kind of quick introduction to what the interior of the Banqueting Hall in the Glasgow City Chambers looks like. And we have these two fascinating sketches, as I say, for that scheme that was done by four Glasgow boys, as well as Walton. There was George Henry and one or two others. And here are the two sketches, as I say, that we have in the Hunterian, which are really the very first sort of ideas, as far as we can understand things anyway, that came to light for this scheme when it was being planned. And they were actually given to the Hunterian Art Gallery by the collector James McCallan, which is rather appropriate since one of the sketches, as you can see, shows the building of Glasgow Cathedral, and the University of Glasgow's very first classes took place in the chapter house of the cathedral. So, and in turn, Walton's son John was Regius Professor of Botany at the university in the 20th century. So there are these links that make it very appropriate that we've come to own these sketches. As you can see, they're very impressionistic, they're airy, they're in watercolour and gouache, that's watercolour with added white for greater density, and they're really quite small, about 20 by 24 centimetres each. And as you can see also, they're divided by these vertical bands to indicate how they look in situ the hall. So they were almost certainly some kind of trial run. The actual murals were done in oil on canvas in the artist's studios. And here's what Walton eventually painted, which, as you can see, glued to the wall by this special process of marouflage that was in use for murals in the 19th century and earlier centuries also. As you can see, it's a different subject. It's not the same as the two sketches. So obviously something changed to get to where we are now with what you see on the walls. In fact, he painted a subject called Glasgow Fair. So more on that in a few minutes. Just quickly, I'm going to show you the first mural in the scheme, which is a lunette above the one end of the hall. Then there's the picture by Alexander Roche of the finding of the ring, part of the legend of St Mungo that underpins the city's coat of arms motifs of the fish, the bird, the bell, the ring. More on that in a few minutes too. Then we've got the picture that Walton ultimately painted. And then finally, we have this lovely, fascinating mural by Sir John Lavery, as he eventually became, showing modern shipbuilding on the Clyde, a subject that notably depicts contemporary life. And that was a radical departure at this point from the formula of historical subjects that had been used in murals at the Palace of Westminster earlier in the 19th century, which had revived mural painting in Britain essentially, and also in Manchester Town Hall, where Maddox Brown had done murals in the 1880s. And those were the two kind of key previous British schemes that the Glaswegians would have known when they decided to install murals in the 1899 to 1901 period in the city chambers here in Glasgow. But modern life subjects were something that were appearing very prominently in the murals being commissioned in France by the French Third Republic and the Paris municipality as a way to project their values and identity. So I'll pick that up in a few minutes. There were also a few smaller murals, as you can see at the very top of the subject by Lavery here. Here's just a little close-up. It's rather delightful. Lavery has personified the arts. There's a woman with a palette and an easel and so on, and he signed his name on the back of the easel painting that's propped behind her. So the little witty touches here and there in the scheme. Anyway, to move forward, there's one of the other little murals above a doorway showing a personification of the Clyde, the River Clyde. Other subjects along the top there show the other Scottish rivers. Well, there's the outside of the building. And as you can see, this grand building that's started in 1883 after a big competition that an architect called William Young from Paisley wins, is completed in 1888 and opened by Queen Victoria. It replaced three earlier civic buildings that had successively become too small for Glasgow's administrative and ceremonial needs as its population swelled with the city's commercial and industrial success. And you can see that this grand Venetian Renaissance style of architecture with its cupolas is essentially aligning Glasgow with the historic Venetian Republic, with its merchant princes and commercial enterprise that were seen as kind of prototypes for Glasgow's own industrialists and businessmen in the 19th century. And the sculptures on the facade, of which you see the wonderful pediment in detail at the right, are illustrations really of things to do with empire and identity. The pediment marked Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, with subjects from the four quarters of the world coming to pay her homage. And inside the building then, there was very lavish use of materials from all over the world, marble from Italy, paneling in fine woods from around the world. However, the murals form an interesting kind of counterpoint to that in some ways, because as the historian Groton has noted, they don't show empire, they show things to do with the city. And that's why it's particularly interesting to look at them in this context of 850 years. So empire and monarchy in the exterior sculpture, but inside this kind of historical emphasis that features the city of Glasgow. Well, how did the murals come about, and how do Walton's little sketches fit into the story? Well, after the city chambers was opened by Queen Victoria in 1888, one visitor, the Edinburgh polymath and social reformer Sir Patrick Geddes, complained that there was plenty of well-wrought mahogany, lots of marble like you see here, but no mural paintings. And Geddes knew and very much admired this kind of thing that was being created in Paris. He knew these modern new French murals that I've mentioned to you, where these values of national and civic identity were being projected. This is one that's very famous, the wood sacred to the arts and muses in the Sorbonne in Paris. But there were murals also in municipal buildings like the Hôtel de Ville, the counterpart to the city chambers in Paris. These were installed quite recently, a few years before the Glasgow murals, and as you can see, they're of contemporary subjects. Fire personified by a man with some kind of industrial smelting process going on, and earth by a woman with all the things that could be obtained from nature in a farming context. So the city council, whether spurred directly by what Geddes said or simply by reports of these murals going up in France, including modern life subjects, actually sent a delegation to Paris, to Amiens, where there was an important scheme by Puvis de Chavannes, who did that Sorbonne mural I showed you a minute ago, and also to Italy. And in Italy, they looked at actual, Renaissance murals from the time of the Venetian Republic. And this delegation went off in 1894 and had a lovely tour of all these places and reported back. Indeed, already at the inaugural banquet for the laying of the foundation stone for the city chambers in 1883, one of the speakers had commented that the city chambers are to be our local pantheon. Now we are going to have a splendid Hôtel de Ville. So there seems to have been some sort of awareness, not just of what was happening in Britain, but of this wider continental context already at that point. But it came to a head with this delegation going to look at modern murals in 1894 in Paris and old murals in Italy. So what did they see? Well, they reported back very enthusiastically about the murals in the Paris Pantheon, which was originally a religious building, but was now given over under the French Third Republic to commemoration of city of Paris and the great history of France and all the kings and queens and whatever who had brought it to its modern state. And Puvis de Chavannes had painted the kind of foundational images in this sequence, showing the life of Saint Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris. So these are just 4 images of those huge murals. It's difficult to get an image that shows them clearly, but you can maybe imagine these around the interior of the building. Well, in a sense, we might see Walton's sketches and the mural of St. Mungo that Roche contributed to the scheme as picking up from this theme of the life of the patron saint of Paris here. After all, here we've got Mungo's, in Walton's sketch here of the burial of Fergus, an incident from the life of St. Mungo, written up by Bishop Jocelyn in medieval times, that tells of how Mungo took the aged St. Fergus for burial at a place called Cathures and carried him on a cart using 2 white bulls that he had mastered with the spirit of Fergus, the holy identity of Fergus, as it were, passes into his acolyte Mungo and enables Mungo to conquer the wildness of the bulls and make them draw the cart. And Walton has included an angel flying in front just to kind of emphasize this Holy Spirit carrying the little group. So they arrive at Cathures. Fergus is buried there, and Cathures then becomes the actual site where the cathedral is built and where Glasgow grows up as a city from that early foundation by Mungo. But the idea of the spirit passing from Fergus into Mungo is very much an echo of what's happening at the centre of Puvis de Chavannes' Pantheon mural in Paris, where we have the Bishop of Auxerre giving, as it were, a blessing to the young child Saint Geneviève, and his spirit passing into Geneviève inspires her for her future duties. So it's a kind of Scottish Glaswegian version of that, if you want to think of it that way. And in the background, there's a lovely breezy landscape, which reminds us that Walton was, in the 1880s, a painter of landscape, out of doors, part of the Glasgow Boy tradition. The other sketch that he did shows the building of Glasgow Cathedral on that site in Cathures, where Fergus had been buried by Mungo, and the origin of Glasgow basically is being depicted here. And we've got the Bishop of Glasgow standing in the central section discussing a great big plan with clerics and workmen and so on. And we might compare French examples again here, because building, as the art historian Richard Thompson has shown, was an absolutely kind of central theme in a lot of these murals in the new Paris municipal buildings, like this sketch that we see here for a mural in a suburb of Paris, which is too big to photograph in actuality, but you've got that theme of construction, modern labourers, but it's the theme of construction, building as an image of growth and identity in the future. So at the right of Walton's little sketch, trying to get this, there we are. You can see that there's a horse being reined in. That's rather intriguing. It's a large Clydesdale type horse, a kind of domestic counterpart, if you like, to the spiritual mastery of the wild bulls portrayed in his other sketch, the Mungo burying Fergus subject. So I'll come back to that horse, but if you can just keep it in mind, it'd be useful. Anyway, we've got early religious origins then in these two sketches. Early religious origins of Glasgow as a city, combined with little nods to the recent French murals, and all portrayed in Walton's rather characteristic, free, atmospheric, plein air, open air style, partly inspired by developments in modern French painting. It's actually rather amusing to turn to a little sketch that he did around this time, or possibly around this time, we're not quite sure when it was done, where he is actually painting out of doors, but a bull has come along, and it's not a nice docile bull at all, like the one in the burial of Fergus. Instead, it's a pretty live and a pretty angry bull, and poor old Walton shows himself leaping out of the way, his hair standing on end. So the problems of plein air painting are nicely encapsulated in this image. But let's return to the banqueting hall. Oh, sorry, it's difficult to move on with these. For some reason online it doesn't seem to move the normal way. Right, here we are. Returning to the banqueting hall and what Walton ultimately painted, here would seem to be a further stage in his thinking towards the final mural. Now he's on the subject that was ultimately painted, the Glasgow Fair in medieval times, or at least in the around 1500, and it's a very beautiful image, a sketch, which is in the Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre. But you can see he's transformed from that image of the tamed bulls into one of a horse being reined in, because Glasgow Fair was held on a piece of land that Bishop Turnbull gave to the city in the medieval period, and it grew up essentially as a kind of event at which animals were bought and sold. So that's what's going on here, and we have some sort of temporary structure that's been put up on what is ultimately now Glasgow Green. We've got Clyde in the background, and we've got what looks like a cleric. Interesting little reminder of the gift originally from Turnbull of this place where the fair is held. And we've got Highlanders and maybe a cleric or two, as I say, and a jester here. So an interesting collection of people, but it's as though Walton hasn't quite abandoned his original ideas, but they're just infiltrating into this evolution of the theme of man taming nature that had appeared in the burial of Fergus. Well, it's worth perhaps pausing here just to think about this imagery in a wider Scottish context, because just a year or two before the City Chambers mural project got going in the late 1890s, Sir Patrick Geddes, that man who had so pointedly criticised the Glasgow City Chambers for having well-wrought mahogany but no mural paintings, had actually himself commissioned murals from the young Edinburgh painter John Duncan. Oops. Oh, there we are. Getting there. Who had done the mural that you see on the left here for the common room of a building called University Hall that Geddes had established at Ramsay Garden next to the castle in Edinburgh. And Ramsay Gardens University Hall was decorated with a series of murals of Scottish legend and history by Duncan as an appropriate context for the holding of Geddes's summer schools, where he brought thinkers and important scientists, geographers like Elisée Reclus and even the philosopher William James, for example, together to think about a way of renewing Scotland and bringing modern industrial Scotland into a better place where there would be less pollution, less suffering of citizens in old rundown buildings and so on. Geddes was a great social reformer. Anyway, as you can see, Duncan has shown the journey of St Mungo as part of this scheme, which still exists, but in rather a kind of poor state, unfortunately, from the front. So we've got Fergus sitting upright in the cart as Mungo masters very visibly these still quite wild bulls to take him on his journey to Cathures. But it's as though Walton has deliberately decided not to show that frontal type of depiction, which is almost heraldic, and instead to create something almost naturalistic as he sees this little procession going from the sideways on across the landscape to Cathures. So Geddes was leading what he called the Celtic revival with all this work and employing Duncan to illustrate the idea of past turning into present. We might see Walton then as aware of that. There were quite direct links between the Glasgow Boys and what Geddes was doing in Edinburgh. They knew each other, Duncan and the Glasgow Boys, but Walton deliberately taking a slightly different approach. Indeed, we might see the horse being reined in. Oh, there we are. As Walton rather intriguingly alluding to the Basilica of St. Mark's, where we have the horses, the great quadriga taken from an original Roman sculpture and placed up at the top of the facade of the cathedral building. As one of the real landmarks of Venice and something that any self-respecting modern Glaswegian wanting to allude to Glasgow's links back to the Venetian Republic and its trading and historic commercial reputation would have tried to perhaps make a little reference to anyway. So it's as though Walton is looking to that idea borrowed from the Mungo story of man gaining control over the forces of nature, putting it not in the context of the story of St Mungo anymore, but in an actual kind of real life effect of Glasgow Fair with a man selling a horse, and then looking as he does so to this very famous example from Venetian architecture and design itself. But we can also remember that Clydesdales were a key export, Clydesdale horses in the late 19th century from Scotland to Australia and New Zealand. So yes, we have modern and historic events in Glasgow in the city chambers murals, but we also perhaps have this undercurrent still of Glasgow as an imperial city, the second city of empire as it was known, and its trading links and its imperial links with other parts of the world being kind of alluded to. So just to round up then, how does Walton's mural, as ultimately conceived here, fit into this larger scheme? Well, it's worth saying that originally the entire scheme was given to Alexander Roche, but Roche was allowed to share it with his Glasgow boy colleagues. And so it is that we have the Walton picture actually forming the third in the sequence. Oh, sorry. I'm usually able just to touch a button on my keyboard and move on, but I have to do it with the mouse at the moment because I'm online. Some strange tech issue here. So here we have the first mural, just a closer view of it, which is by George Henry, William the Lionheart granting a charter. And as you can see, there are little details that kind of pick up what Walton was doing. Here, after all, is Glasgow Cathedral under construction in the background. Here, after all, are two animals, dogs, domestic animals, but they're still having to be leashed in and held in control by this little boy. So very exciting image here, which is very arresting, with the idea of Glasgow as the dear green place, the traditional translation of glasshu in the Celtic, very much visible with the green kind of grass. Henry actually said he was trying for strong colour, tartan landscape and vivid contrasts, as if the notion of painting a mural for the city had slightly gone to his head, and he wanted to make Glasgow subsume Scotland itself as a kind of land of tartan. So it's a very decorative, almost pre-Raphaelite kind of colour scheme that he has here. Anyway, after Henry's lunette, we have, wait for it. There we are. Roche's own picture. They're very difficult to photograph, these murals, because the light comes directly from big windows opposite them. And so it's almost impossible to get a true colour scheme, but you can perhaps make out from this that Roche's is a slightly paler, more atmospheric, more impressionistic. Indeed, it's quite like some of the tonalities that Puvis de Chavannes used. And he's showing Mungo miraculously finding Queen Langareth's ring in the mouth of a Clyde salmon after she'd lost it and enlisted his help. And the robin he miraculously brought back to life in another of his saintly miracles sits in an adjacent tree just up here. But again, by featuring Mungo, the mural in a sense absorbs Walton's iconography from his early sketch of Mungo taking Fergus for burial. Very delicate, very naturalistic, but actually there's a very fascinating little detail here. I've put it up in the right here, of the ring that was discovered by Mungo in the mouth of the salmon, which is gilded. So you can almost tactically, almost feel it. It stands forward in a kind of tactile way from the surface of the mural. And there are other little bits of gilding elsewhere, as though he's reminding us this is a legend, it's not real life. Then we've got the Walton subject itself. Then we've got, finally, Lavery's wonderful modern life subject. Men operate a winch at the centre of the mural. Another man tends a brazier at one side at the left. We've got a ship in dry dock being built, and then the Clyde. And it's almost a reprise of that little view of the Clyde that you see in the distance in the earlier sketches that I've shown you by Walton. So it's as though history is reborn in Roche's finding of the ring mural, and then in the background of Walton's Glasgow Fair, where you've got the river again, and then in turn in Lavery's picture. And we have that sense of the mastery of the powerful horse by the ordinary labourer that's the focal motif in the Glasgow Fair mural, that works through from the motif of the bulls held in check by Mungo as he brings Fergus for burial, becoming, I would suggest, a kind of emblem of the resourceful Glaswegian, because now the men are using machines, not horses, but mastering, as it were, their work with the aid of tools, mastering fire here to make industrial products for the ship, turning the winch, using power of their own selves to make the industrial processes work. And this kind of narrative of the modern shipbuilders who master the waves, working on from the little boy holding back the dogs and the story of the bulls whom Mungo, or which Mungo controls, is, I think, a little leitmotif that runs through. Well, we don't know the full story of the creation of the murals, nor why Walton experimented with these two subjects that weren't ultimately included, but we can probably regard the sketches as the kind of thing that was produced for approval by the city council, very much on the model of what went on in the Paris municipal schemes, as though they were designs that had to be submitted for some kind of municipal approval. And there were little sketches, as I mentioned, that Roche and Lavery did for their murals as part of a similar system to the Paris scheme. And it's very nice to see that Joe Meacock from Glasgow Museums is actually going to be giving a little tour of some of those sketches that the city holds in the Glasgow Museums Resource Centre for the murals by Roche and Lavery. So just to finish then, civic mural painting in the 19th and early 20th centuries in Britain was typically what we might call a form of invention of tradition, to borrow a phrase that's used by historians. Eric Hobsbawm and others have spoken of this phenomenon whereby you look back to something historic but bring it into your own times and reinvent it. So reinventing an art associated with medieval churches and Renaissance palaces, as in Venice, that conferred status, kind of reflected glory on the new systems of local government introduced by municipal legislation in the 19th century, and the tripartite compositions of the three large murals at Glasgow, of course, recall medieval and Renaissance triptychs. However, the scheme's contemporary life element is distinctive at this point in Britain. Most British town halls, when they had murals, which was by no means always, favoured historical subjects, purely historical, no modern life. And that's what you get in Westminster, as I've mentioned, in the 1840s to 60s, and again in Manchester with Maddox Brown's scheme at Manchester Town Hall in the 1880s. Also, the prominence of the common labourer in the Banqueting Hall work, from Henry's vassal with dogs to Walton's farmhand reining in a pair of Clydesdale horses and Lavery's muscular winchmen, traces a very suggestive continuity between past and present, and it complements the strong social preoccupations of the turn of the century Glasgow corporation. I think it's this empathy with the daily lives of working people that unifies the murals rather than common features of style, because they are very different in their styles, as you can see in this little row that I've made of them at the bottom of this slide. So although they're painted a little after the heyday of the plein air out of doors work done by the Glasgow Boys, they are a logical development of the rural labour imagery that had sealed the group's reputation around Sir James Guthrie in the 1880s. They were one of the very first major municipal mural schemes in Scotland. Edinburgh's city chambers was only decorated some years later by William Hole, who had done murals in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. And it's only fitting, I think, that in more recent times we have a revival again. Oh, turn on. Seem to want me to turn on. Let's see if we can do it here. Oh, those were a couple of the sketches that are in the Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre. Finally, here is the modern revival. A couple of the murals that were created by Sam Bates in the High Street on the Mungo legend, just in the last decade and a bit, really, following the commercial and financial problems that emerged after the financial crisis of 2008. This was a way to rejuvenate the city. And there's a very fascinating trail that you can follow at the little link I put there, murals, to see. So in a way, history has literally turned full circle, as already it was doing in that fascinating past-present dialogue in the Glasgow City Chambers themselves. So thank you for listening. I'll be happy to try and answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Claire. That was brilliant. And yes, if anyone's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat, and I'll read those out for you. Just before we joined the talk, Claire, you were talking about your research for a book on mural painting. So I was just going to ask, like, when did you first encounter Walton's sketches? And maybe for the benefit of the people online today, you can talk a little bit about your research and that book.
Oh, well, yes, I encountered the sketches, I think, when I first came to Glasgow, which was eons ago, prehistory, in 1984. And then I was a temporary lecturer and then became permanent lecturer from 1985. And at that point, I was still finishing my PhD, which was on mural painting in London. But I was aware of, other cities having interesting murals. And so I was immediately attracted when I found there were these two sketches in the Hunterian collection. And then I finished the PhD and wrote a book on mural painting in Britain from 1840 to 1940. And there was a chapter on city civic town hall murals, which featured the Glasgow scheme amongst others like Manchester and Edinburgh and Leeds and Liverpool and so on. So if there was more time, I would show you some of these other examples, but it was very clear that Glasgow was kind of a way out in front by sending this delegation to Paris looking at the Italian murals. None of the other cities did that. So very interesting. Anyway, that's how the Hunterian sketches came into my ken, as it were. Mm.
Thank you. And also, just from those images, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell sort of the scale of the works that we're talking.
Yes.
But I wondered if you had some sort of idea around the scale and also how long it would have taken for them to complete this mural scheme.
Well, it is really interesting just looking at it there. It is a pretty large banqueting hall. I'm not sure how many it seats, but it's the place where, ceremonies were held for making Nelson Mandela freeman of the city and things like that. And they began them in 1899 and finished them in 1902. So it was remarkably speedy. Those are the big panels. I think the smaller ones that you see above there were added possibly a little later. Not quite sure about that. It's difficult to disentangle the exact date span from the records, but they would have been painted in the artist studios and then stuck to the wall with this kind of special glue called in a technique called marouflage. Mm.
Lovely. And also I wondered if, so obviously, each artist has taken a section here in the banqueting hall, but they did work together, didn't they, as a collective? So I wondered if there's any sort of record or history of whether they worked directly in conversation on these. And I know you made some links between each other's works and whether that was deliberate and if they would have spoken about this work.
Yes, I know. It's kind of tantalizing. I really think they probably did because of those links I made. And I actually think, these could have been the origin starting point just because of these themes that then recur in the murals themselves about man taming animals and the horse that comes at the right hand side of the building of Glasgow Cathedral and then reappears in the actual mural of the Glasgow Fair subject. I suspect they, visited each other's studios, had a good old conversation, never put anything in writing, maybe went together to the city chambers, decided what they were going to do. Yes, one of the mysteries. Hmm.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Claire. I think that's just about all we've got time for today. Thank you for this talk, and thank you everyone for joining us online today. A recording of this talk will be made available in due course, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend when it comes to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.